Okay, well this is a real hot potato, this one, and I know this isn't going to be a very easy video for me to make, and I know that because this is about take 7 already, and I haven't got any more than about 40 fucking seconds into it so far. Let's see if I get a little bit better this time. I want to discuss the subjects of victim blaming and rape apology, specifically as I kind of get there as and when in the video, but crime apology generally. I say rape apology specifically, because people seem to dwell more on that aspect of apologistic behaviour than they do with other crimes when similar behaviours or things that they regard as that kind of behaviour manifest. So that's one of the reasons. The other reason is that it pertains particularly because these subjects have come up recently. I got involved in an exchange on Twitter involving Thunderfoot because he'd made a video recently, which I'm not going to go into Thunderfoot's video other than to say that I found it somewhat ham-fisted and unempathetic, and in some cases wrong. I don't want to go any more into that because I'm not bothered by that. What I want to do is tell you what I think, not what somebody else thinks. If you want to watch his video, I'll link it. If you want to check out the Twitter exchange, then you can look through my tweets and pick up the exchange there. I also left some comments on Mike Booth, who does the Grey Bloke. He's got a blog, some old grey bloke.blogspot.com, I think is the address there. I'll chuck a link down there as well to that one. So the things that I wanted to discuss is victim blaming and crime apology. More to the generalizations in a minute. First I want to define victim blaming, because some people have a somewhat tautological definition of victim blaming. They don't mean simply blaming a victim, they mean unreasonable criticism of a victim's behaviour. So there's a somewhat tautological definition. Within the definition, it guarantees that victim blaming is wrong because it is unreasonable criticism. Of course, if that's your definition of victim blaming, then victim blaming is wrong by definition. The definition that I'm going to use of victim blaming here now is simply blaming the victim, criticising the behaviour of the victim, let us say to make them in part architects of their own misfortune. Is victim blaming always wrong is one question that I want to ask on this video. Is victim blaming the same thing as crime apology, as some people seem to assume? If they find somebody guilty of victim blaming or unreasonable victim blaming, let's say, they assume that they are an apologist, and that's something that I think is absolutely wrong. And hasn't been thought through if that's something that you've done. And the other thing is this idea, I want to open the sphere to crimes beyond sex crimes, because I don't buy this idea that as soon as a crime has a sexual element, no matter how small, then suddenly ways of discussing that crime that were on the table and acceptable are suddenly kicked in the long grass. You know, if you smash me in the bollocks with your size 12 bother boot, or whether you fondle my testicles with your fingers, if they're unwanted on my part, they are both crimes, both against me and against my gonads. But just because one of them had a sexual element, I don't think that puts things off the table, means that we can't discuss that crime in certain ways just because it has that sexual element. They're both crimes against a person. I could be personally affected, mentally as well as physically, in both cases. I would hope that in both cases those crimes would be dealt with a degree of compassion towards me and a degree of empathy, especially in the immediate aftermath, and especially if you were talking about my crime specifically rather than making generalisations. But I think we could still employ the same methods of discussing both my actions leading up to the crime and the actions of the perpetrator of the crime in both cases. So The first question with regard to that then is, are we all victim blamers? Do we all victim blame? Some people are very anti-victim blaming, and they'll stand there and they'll say you should never blame a victim. It's always wrong to blame the victim. And then on the next day they'll be watching the television and see some fucking terrorist act that's taken place in some Western democracy and say something along the lines of, well, what do we expect? We've made people in these countries hate us, and then when they come and bomb our cities, you know, what should we expect? We've supplied some of these people with weapons, we've sponsored certain regimes, you know, and then we wonder when crimes are perpetrated on ourselves as a result of some of our actions there, we only have ourselves to blame. If that isn't victim blaming, I don't know what is. And if that isn't something that you do, I can guarantee, and this is a fucking copper bottom guarantee, that everybody who watches this video, there is some sphere of crime or other. Maybe somebody's, you've already told them once or twice to get fucking antivirus software for the computer. They haven't done it. They've got a fucking virus. They tell you about it and you think, for fuck's sake, why didn't you get the antivirus software? Everybody does it in one sphere or another. The question is, when is it appropriate and when isn't it appropriate? In my view, regardless of whether the crime is a crime against the person or otherwise, regardless of whether the crime has a sexual element or otherwise, there are two things that define whether that victim blaming is appropriate. Three things. The first is it just basically mistimed? It's maybe not the best time to tell somebody that what they did may have contributed to their own downfall. The second thing is it proportionate? Is what you're saying proportionate to the effect, to the damage that's been done and to the behaviours? And the third thing is, was their behaviour within the normal realms of expected behaviour, or was their behaviour excessively reckless? Let me give you an example of what I mean by that. I like biking. I like going out on my bike, clocking up a few miles on the road. It's a decent bike. It's a carbon frame bike with a decent group set, Dura-Ace group set, so it's worth a few quid there. If I was to go to the local shops on that bike, park the bike up in the bike rack, go in the shop, buy a few groceries, I'm only in there for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, come out and the bike is stolen. You might have a few things to say to me when I'm telling you that, and that might depend on my actions. If I hadn't locked the bike up, I think what you probably say to me is, first, well, I'm sorry to hear your bike's been stolen, Jim, but Jesus, that's quite a valuable bike you've got there, and you've left it outside a shop that loads of people who you don't know walk past, and you didn't bother locking it up. Surely you must have realised there was a fair chance that somebody was going to steal your fucking bike there. That's really a reckless way to have acted, Jim. I'm sorry, I've got to say, I might have some sympathy for you, but, you're partly responsible for losing your bike there. Really, sunshine. Now, let's say I'd locked my bike up. Some people would still be critical even if I'd locked my bike up. They'd say, well, what do you expect? If you have a decent bike, you can expect to get it nicked. If you have a decent bike, you shouldn't have it out in public. Or you should only have it out in public when it's directly underneath your arse. Now, I think these two things are different. I think the first example is an example of reasonable victim blaming, and the second is an example of unreasonable victim blaming. Why? Because the first behaviour, my behaviour, lay outside the normal bounds of expected behaviour. The normal bounds of expected behaviour is, if you own a bike, other than a bike that's absolutely fucking worthless, if you leave it outside a shop, you lock the fucking bike up because that's common sense. The second is unreasonable because I'd gone to that length. I had locked the bike up. I had taken the precaution. I behaved in what is a normal fashion in the culture and the society in which I live. I hadn't done anything unremarkable. I hadn't done anything remarkably reckless in the way that I'd behaved. I'd locked my bike up, and yet somebody's come along in broad daylight with people walking past, sawn through the lock, bold as brass, and then driven off on my bike. I think that is unfair victim blaming, and that's a big differentiator. And this was part of the problem, and I know that I said I wasn't going to dwell on Thunderfoot's video, but I do make my videos somewhat organically after sketching out what I'm going to say. It was part of the problem that I had with Thunderfoot's video, which is that he didn't differentiate. He just basically said that things can be done to minimise your risk, and therefore if you don't do those things to minimise your risk, then it's quite acceptable to criticise people for not doing those things. No, that's wrong. That's entirely wrong-headed, that perspective. There are some things which are reckless, which if you do those things and didn't do those things, then you would reduce your risk. And I think it's absolutely fine for us to point those things out and to criticise people when they do reckless actions. But if your actions are within the normal bounds of human behaviour, such as the classic example is women being criticised for wearing skimpy and revealing clothing, that is, within the culture with which I live, that is perfectly normal behaviour. Especially on a Friday, Saturday night, women, especially younger women, go out exposing a lot of flesh. That is perfectly normal and an accepted thing to do. So it's really unfair to criticise for things which are normal, accepted behaviour. True enough, maybe if instead of wearing a short skirt and a top with tits spilling out, a woman went out dressed in sackcloth from head to toe, that may, statistically speaking, reduce a chance of being raped. But she could reduce the chance even further if she never left her front door. If she encased herself in 10 tons of concrete, she could pretty much fucking copper bottom guarantee herself that she wouldn't get raped at all. But that isn't a fair criticism to make, because the way she's acted is within the normal bounds of behaviour. And I think that's how we have to look at situations such as this. Was some particular behaviour within the normal bounds, or was it abnormally reckless? If I went on the way home after a night out, I can afford a taxi, I would get a taxi home. If I had to walk home, I'd try and walk home in the best lit areas that I could. If for some unknown, godforsaken reason I decided to start heading down dark alleyways on the way home in a busy town or a busy city, and I got beaten up for doing so, I'm sure most people would say that's actually pretty stupid behaviour. Most people know you shouldn't do that. If you're aware, Jim, that you shouldn't do that, then you're worthy of some criticism for that. That's what makes the difference, I think, in all these cases, whether sex is involved or whether isn't sex is involved. That's the difference between legitimately blaming a victim, I propose, and being somewhat mean-spirited, wrong-headed, and illegitimately blaming a victim for some crime that has been perpetrated upon them. That's victim blaming, but what about crime apology? I sometimes see people who are blaming victims, sometimes blaming victims in the most mean-spirited sense, being accused of crime apology, more often than not rape apology, and I think no, that isn't, because they haven't gone the extra mile. So what is the extra mile you need to go for it to be a crime apology? Well, the extra mile is this. What we're talking about here generally is not like we would perhaps in a civil case, in a negligence case, where you have the idea of contributory negligence, which is that, I don't know, maybe I'm in the pub and I have a drink in the pub and there's a chip in the glass and I cut my mouth, slice my mouth open on the glass. So I sue the pub. And when I sue the pub, it comes up in the questioning. I say, well, actually, I've drunk in that pub before, and I've had a glass with a cut in the rim before. And so, what the judge might decide in that case is, well, yeah, the pub is culpable. They've given you a glass with a cut. They had your duty of care there, and so they are guilty. But You've already had a glass from that pub with a cut in it. You know that their glass housekeeping is not perfect. So what we're going to say is you're 20% responsible for your downfall and the pub is 80% responsible for your downfall. This is how much money your inconvenience and your wound is worth. We're going to award you 80% of that because we're holding you 20% responsible of what happened to you. Now, if that's what you're doing in your victim blaming, then that is a crime apology. If you're saying that this action that this person did diminishes the action of the perpetrator of the crime, if you say something like, if you go back to my bike example, perfect example that I gave there, that because I left my bike unlocked and somebody stole it, well, you can't really blame somebody for stealing the bike, can you? I mean, they could hardly help themselves. If you see a nice bike and it's unlocked, you can hardly help yourself stealing the bike. You can't blame the thief because the bike wasn't locked. That would be being a crime apologist. If that's what you're doing with regard to sexual crimes, then I propose that is what makes you a rape apologist. If Thunderfoot, to go back to Thunderfoot, if what he was saying was these different things that could diminish the chance of a woman being raped or sexual assault, if he was saying that by her not doing that, that takes away some of the blame of the person who perpetrated the rape, then he is a rape apologist. I have to say in his defence, I didn't see him do that. I didn't see him say anything which said that both the moral guilt and culpability of the person who committed a rape in those circumstances and the likely sentence that one should receive for having done so should be diminished in any way, shape or form by the things that he was talking about. My view, maybe I missed something on his video when I watched it, my view was that he had been unreasonable in his victim blaming, but he hadn't acted as a rape apologist. Okay, well, I hope that outlines pretty much where I'm at with this. I hope I haven't said anything in this video that hurts or really offends anybody. That certainly hasn't been the aim of this video. It's simply to outline how I look at this in the whole with regard to crime generally, and to say that I don't see the sphere of crimes that involve some sexual element as being entirely apart in the way that we discuss them from other crimes. That's pretty much all I want to say. I hope it's given a few of you some food for thought. I'd be delighted to hear what you have to say on this, and with regard to that and the way that YouTube has fucked up video responses, this is something that I'm starting now. Maybe you'd like to join me on this. If anybody wants to make a video response to me, make the video response, send me a PM, and what I will do in the footnotes underneath the video, right at the top of the footnotes, the first thing that I will put in the footnotes is any video responses that I receive. I think that's the best way to make up for what YouTube has done, which has denied us this ability to make video responses to other people's videos, and I hope other people will join me in that. Okay, well, thank you for watching this video, and bye for now.